Thank you for that lovely welcome. So yes, I am Cath Mercer, and I've been billed as a sex statistician. Well, I am a statistician. I'm currently leading the analysis of the 3rd National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, which is the official name of Britain's National Sex Survey. And so yes, I guess that does make me a sex statistician. So you may be wondering, well, how does one become a sex statistician? Good question. Well, it certainly wasn't what my mother had in mind for me. In fact, even now, when she's asked what I do, she tends to vaguely say something about statistics in a hospital and perhaps mentions HIV/AIDS to legitimise it somewhat, a point I shall return to later on. So, a bit about me. My first degree was in demography at the University of Southampton, if anyone's interested. And I then went on to study for a master's in applied statistics. Don't switch off, honest. But I must admit, I wasn't really that interested in solving equations and deriving fancy formulae. I was more interested in the application of statistics. And so for my PhD, I decided to look at age mixing. What's age mixing, I hear you cry? Good question. It's part of the broader concept of sexual mixing, which refers to the extent to which sexual partners are similar, what we call assortative mixing, or not, dissociative mixing. And the idea is that if you're like your sexual partner in terms of age, ethnicity, where you live, and so on, then that incurs different risks and therefore different, potentially different sexual health outcomes than if you have sex with someone who's not like you. So, as an example, imagine a man in his 50s. Maybe he's having a bit of a midlife crisis, I don't know. But say he hooks up with a much younger model, shall we say. And so he engages in dissociative age mixing. And so he encounters a different risk of acquiring a sexually transmitted infection, an STI, than if he'd hooked up with someone similar to him in terms of age. Why? Well, we know that there's a higher prevalence of STIs among the younger population, so typically those under 25. So an older person, in this case a bloke in his 50s, having sex with a younger person, exposes the older person to similar risks of acquiring an STI that younger person encounters. Simples, or maybe not. How do we know all this? Well, data on all STIs diagnosed in sexual health clinics have been collated for surveillance purposes for decades now. Time for a little graph, I think. Here we go. Let's try that one. Oh, okay, so here we've got a lovely chart showing the number of cases of gonorrhea that have been diagnosed in sexual health clinics over much of the 20th century. And we can see some interesting trends here. So, for example, following the 2 world wars, there were slight increases, reflecting perhaps all the making of love and not war. Mid-1940s, there's a sharp decline, reflecting the introduction of penicillin. And then through the 1960s, the swinging 60s, and into the psychedelic 70s, there's a steady increase before a sharp decline in the mid-80s, corresponding with the emergence of HIV/AIDS. And at that time, we see a decline in the number of gonorrhea cases diagnosed, because at that time there was an increase in safer sex practices, in part due to public health campaigns like this one, which you may remember if you're in the UK in the mid to late 80s, the Don't Die of Ignorance, rather scary public health campaign. So while all this, all these routinely collected surveillance data are useful for monitoring trends, they don't really provide much of an epidemiological explanation for what's going on in the population. Now, obviously, finding out about who has sex with whom is no mean feat, as it's not really the sort of thing that you can stop people in the street and ask them about. Excuse me, madam, have you got 2 minutes before you nip into Tesco's for me to ask you a couple of questions about your sex life? I think not. That said, there have been studies of sexual behaviour for some time now. Kinsey, pictured here, Kinsey's groundbreaking research resulting in the publication of these two rather controversial books in the 1940s and 50s, provided the first insight into what was actually normal behaviour and not deviant behaviour, as others had previously thought. But subsequent surveys in the 1960s and 1970s tended to focus more on fertility and reproduction because sexual behaviour was still considered very much a taboo subject. That is, of course, until the advent of HIV/AIDS in the 1980s, which really prioritised the need for reliable data to inform public health and epidemiological projections, and so legitimised the study of sex. Now, at this time in Britain, a group of academics at what was the Middlesex Hospital, and is sadly now nothing apart from the chapel, hospital chapel, which apparently is listed, so they can't knock that down. At that time, a group of academics at the Middlesex Hospital decided that they were going to undertake the first probability survey of sexual behaviour in order to get the first reliable data on sex in order to inform HIV/AIDS predictions. And so was born the National Survey of Sexual Attitudes and Lifestyles, or Natsal for short. Of course, it wasn't that straightforward. Despite having undertaken a number of pilot studies and demonstrating that generally the general public were okay about answering questions on sex if asked in the right way, and having the support of the then Chief Medical Officer, Sir Donald Aitchison, on board, and also an increasingly desperate need for reliable data in the fight against AIDS, the promise of public funding did not materialise, as reported by the Sunday Times back in 1989. Yes, Margaret Thatcher, then Prime Minister, decided that the study would be an invasion of people's privacy, and she didn't want her government associated with it. Fortunately, though, for the study and my future career, the Wellcome Trust stepped in at the 11th hour with the funding, and the study could go ahead. And so we interviewed 18,000 men and women aged 16 to 59 from across Britain between 1990 and 1991. How did we get these 18,000 people, you may be wondering? Well, we used the postcode address file, which lists all the postcodes in Britain, and we randomly selected postcodes. And then within the randomly selected postcodes, we randomly selected addresses. And then within the randomly selected addresses within the randomly selected postcodes, we randomly selected one person in the eligible age range, 16 to 59, and invited them to take part in the study. A palaver to explain and a palaver to do, but essential for ensuring that the resulting data from the study could be considered as broadly representative of the general population, and an important distinction between the Natsal studies and the kind of sex survey that you might find in the likes of the Cosmopolitan magazine or the Metro. So what did we ask of our 18,000 people? Well, interviewers from the National Centre for Social Research visited every single person and undertook an hour-long interview with each person, typically in their own home, the respondent's home. It began with a face-to-face interview, asking less sensitive questions, for example, about general health. But for the more sensitive questions on, for example, the numbers of partners people had had, or the sexual practices that they'd engaged in, we asked respondents to fill out a pen and paper questionnaire. At the end of this section, they then put the questionnaire in a sealed envelope, and the interview continued with some more face-to-face questions, again about less sensitive things, and also about sexual attitudes. So, the results of the first survey were published in 1994. Cue my prop here. In this has been described as the most boring book ever written about sex. 500 pages of sexual tidbits, but described as the most boring book ever written about sex, as portrayed in this lovely cartoon from the Sunday Times. I don't know if you can read that. So we weren't upset that the book had been described as the most boring book ever written about sex. On the contrary, the purpose of Natsal, the National Sex Survey, isn't to sensationalise sex. Rather, it's to get reliable data. And as such, it was only a couple of years later, after the publication of the book, that there was a call from the scientific community that the survey be repeated, so that the data that we had could still be the most up-to-date data upon which to base policy and practice decision-making. And so, at the end of 1999, interviews for the second study started to take place, this time with those aged 16 to 44. And so by the beginning of 2001, we'd interviewed over 12,000 people aged 16 to 44 from across Britain. Why the younger age range? Well, data from the first survey had found that sexual risk behaviours tended to be more prevalent in younger people. And so because of limited resources, we decided to focus the study on younger people. Yes, I'm pleased to say that people as old as 44 are considered as young, as far as the second survey is concerned. So the results from this second survey were published as a series of papers in the Lancet Journal on World AIDS Day in 2001, the 1st of December 2001. And as you can imagine, got quite a lot of media attention once again. So what did we find? Well, in a nutshell, in contrast to the first survey in 1990, we found that people were having first sex at a younger age. On average, that is the median age of first sex being 16 for men and women in 2000. We found in 2000 that there was greater reporting of sexual risk behaviours. So, for example, having unsafe sex, and also greater numbers of partners, both men and women, and both same-sex and opposite sex. And that this increase between 1990 and 2000 had been actually greatest for women, what we in part attributed to what we labelled the Spice Girl effect. Bear with me. We felt that thanks to Ginger, Posh and friends for introducing girls and women to girl power in the late 90s, that women felt more comfortable about disclosing their nocturnal naughtiness in the second survey in 2000, in contrast to the first survey back in 1990. We also found that there had been an increase in the intolerance in terms of sexual attitudes, so more tolerant sexual attitudes, especially regarding same-sex practices, same-sex partners, but also more tolerance towards one-night stands and unfaithfulness. Now, how's all this been useful? Well, data from the Natsal studies have informed and continue to inform a number of sexual health policies and practices. So, for example, the National Strategy for Sexual Health and HIV, the National Chlamydia Screening Programme, the HPV vaccine policy, and also sexual health social marketing campaigns such as the Condom Essential Wear campaign that you may have seen. So what's next? What's next for Natsal? Is there any more? Okay. So right now, we're actually carrying out 15,000 interviews with men and women aged 16 to 74, again right across Britain, for the third National Sex Survey. And this time we're thinking about sexual health in its broadest sense. So not just in terms of bugs and babies, but in line with the World Health Organization definition of sexual health. So the data are due to be collected by the end of August, at which point it will be all hands to the pump to try and get the data analysed and disseminated as quickly as possible so that the data are as useful as possible. So watch this space. In the meantime, though, should you be lucky enough to be invited to take part, then please, please, please do so, because the data are anonymised, and the more people we have taking part, so the better the response, the more reliable the data. So I'll just leave you with this cartoon that was published in the Times, because it always makes me smile. Thank you very much.